All right, we're just about ready to start. I'm going to wait another couple of minutes to see if there are anybody else joining. And in about 2-3 minutes or so, we're going to get started. You can let me know in the comments if the voice quality is okay and if the stream quality is okay. If there are any troubles, just please let me know in the comments so I can fix it before we start. All right, excellent. Let's get started. So today will be bootcamp lesson number 1, and today we'll be going over Voex. This is Voex right here, and let's just go over some of the more basic components of Voex. So for this example, why not? We'll use something that everybody is familiar with already, and we're going to go with GME. Let's just give it a second to load. Okay, perfect. All right, so very basic. Anything above this upper black line is called the inhibition zone. When a Voex originally moves into the inhibition zone, that is a bullish finding. And when Voex then moves back out of the inhibition zone, back into stability, that is bearish. The main takeaways are, as long as Voex is in the inhibition zone, we can expect price to move higher. However, it shows from the fact that Voex is now in the inhibition zone that this move higher is provoking instability and isn't being tolerated well by the market, in which case we have to assume that eventually all the gains will be given back, and that eventually will come when Voex moves back down into the stability zone. These middle lines right here, not sure what just happened. These middle lines right here is the stability zone, and that is in between inhibition and propagation below. And when Voex is in stability, that is showing that the stock is stable, and stable stocks we expect to rise in price. Now, I'm just going to refresh the page so that we can get back to normal looking Voex. This last part, the bottom part beneath the lower black line, this is called the propagation zone. And when Voex moves into the propagation zone, that is a bearish finding. And as long as Voex remains in the propagation zone, we have to expect price to move down. For example, here, Voex cracked into the propagation zone and GME suffered some downside price action. And everywhere else that Voex moved into the propagation zone, GME suffered downside. All right, so now we know the basics of what is Voex, what are the 3 zones in Voex. So once more, for those taking notes, the upper part is the inhibition zone, and that is bullish until proven otherwise once Voex moves into the inhibition zone. The middle part is the stability zone. When Voex is moving in stability, then it means that the stock is stable, and naturally stable stocks move to the upside. The bottom part is called the propagation zone, and when Voex moves into the propagation zone, that is considered a bearish finding. All right, so now that we have the general descriptions of the 3 places that Voex can be out of the way, let's go into what exactly is Voex. So Voex stands for volatility over exposure. So to put this, in the most simplistic way possible for all of you, the way to think about Voex is essentially the move that happened in the market today. Did it break something? What do I mean, did it break something? Did it provoke any fighting back in the market? So if the price action that we saw on any given day broke something, meaning broke something that the stock will now move to the upside, or broke something that the stock will now move to the downside, Voex will do a great job of showing that to us before it will happen. If Voex did not break anything, then Voex will be in stability, which is just the stock is stable and we have to expect the price to rise. A great example of that would be right here, where Voex was in the stability zone for quite a long period of time. And what happened to price action during that period of time? you can see price action move positively because throughout this entire time period, Voex was telling us nothing is breaking. Voex price is moving fine to the upside and nothing is breaking. And when Voex is stable, we expect price to move to the upside. Now, let's go back a little bit to 2020 for Meta, and we're going to find something very interesting. So Voex during this entire time period was fairly stable. Obviously, there were some dips down in the propagation zone, but in general, we had a fairly stable Voex for Meta. And you can see Meta starting at 182, ended up moving up all the way to 264 during this period of Voex stability. What happened next? As you guys can see, Voex shot up into the inhibition zone. During this time that Voex was in the inhibition zone, what happened to price? Price moved from about 278 all the way up to about 373 or so, with Voex moving into the inhibition zone. Now, I want you all to pay close attention to what happened next. Suddenly, Voex made a large spike down into the propagation zone. And, after this large spike into the propagation zone, there was some thrashing of Voex. But if you guys look at the price, you can see that it was on a little bit of a decline here. And then Voex pushes back into propagation here. And right after that, Meta falls from about 313 all the way down to the low of about $88. And when Voex moves into the propagation zone, that's when it's telling you, all right, whatever's happening in volatility, in IV, and all the other things that Voex is calculating, it is breaking something. And it's sending off alarm bells. Something is going on here that's causing Voex to move into the propagation zone, and that warrants extreme caution on the long side, or it introduces a concept to a short trade, a put trade, for example. Now, you can see the power of Voex on full on display here, as soon as Voex drops into propagation with this hard spike, although price action isn't currently reflected for a little bit, although obviously this was downside price action, what happened next was a severe decline in price, where price went all the way from 300 to 88. Then what happens next? Voex now moves back into the stability zone, and over a period of time is just stable. Nothing is breaking. So whatever price action that's going on with Meta is not breaking anything in the market, and Meta is able to rise very nicely to the upside, with Voex ending by moving into the inhibition zone early on in May, and that's when Meta saw a sharper rise in price. Now currently, Meta would be bullish until proven otherwise with Voex in inhibition, and would only be bearish if we see Voex move back into stability. So that's one example. So let's just recap. Again, those that are taking notes, you might find it very beneficial to you. When a stock is in stability, we expect it to do what stable stocks do, which is rise in value. Shown right here in this example. If you want to take screenshots as well, that could also be helpful. When Voex is in the inhibition zone, we can expect a rapid rise in price initially, but the end result will normally be a rapid decline back to the original price. Why? Because although Voex moving into the inhibition zone is originally bullish, it is showing us that this move is not being tolerated by the market. It is provoking massive instability and will eventually be followed by downside. When will that downside come? Once Voex moves back into stability zone. Of course, Voex trend, which is this gold line, which is the running average of Voex, is also very important. But for now, we're just going to focus on Voex itself. When Voex moves into the propagation zone, we will usually see a drastic decline in price. So let's look at an example, another example of Voex moving into the propagation zone, followed by a drastic decline in price. All right, so this stock is UMC here, and let's take a little bit of a look inside. So to start, we can see a fairly stable Voex and price slowly rising in value from 229 all the way to about 265. Then we see Voex over this entire period of time make a sharp move into the inhibition zone. And look at price. Price non-stop positive bullish action from $2 all the way to about $11. So that's a 500% increase in price during the time that Voex was in the inhibition zone. But like we said, when Voex moves into the inhibition zone, although it is originally bullish, it will eventually be followed by downside because of the unstableness provoking in the market. When does that downside start? Once Voex moves back into stability and especially down back into propagation. So we can see that after this incredible rise in price from $2 to $11, what happened? Eventually, the instability kicked in and Voex moved into the propagation zone. Once this happened, it pretty much spelled the fate for the stock. And we can see that even though it didn't get knocked down immediately, it first moved into propagation at October 2021. Over the coming period, the stock fell all the way to $5, cutting in half 1 year later. So, and throughout this entire time, Voex didn't really get back into the inhibition zone. It mostly stayed in the propagation zone throughout this entire time, while price suffered its price getting cut in half, while UNC suffered its price getting cut in half. So again, we see the power of the propagation zone to warn for upcoming downside, and we see the power of the inhibition zone to show bullish until proven otherwise. Then what happened next? Voex was in stability. Finally, after being in the propagation zone for a year, it moved back into stability. Price started to climb slowly. Then Voex moved back into the inhibition zone, and price was able to move from about $5 all the way back up to $8. Eventually, Voex moved back into stability, and now the stock is moving pretty much sideways. So again, just another example of the power of inhibition, transitioning into propagation, transitioning back into stability, and transitioning back into inhibition zone. All right, let's take a look at Netflix now. All right, so there's two more things that we haven't discussed yet that we're going to get into now. So for everyone, so far, currently up until this point, we discussed Voex in the stability zone, we've discussed Voex in the inhibition zone, and we've discussed Voex in the propagation zone. Now I want to talk about something called a Voex spike. Now, Voex spikes don't happen too often, but when there is a Voex spike, it usually happens after a period of upside, like a short period of upside, maybe a sharp rise in price. And Voex, instead of climbing higher slowly but surely, Voex spikes to a ridiculous measure, something like this, something like this, something like this, and something like this. These are extreme Voex spikes that Voex is rising an incredible amount while price is only moving a little bit to the upside. Now, Voex spikes are large upwards or downwards movement. So whether Voex spikes upwards or whether Voex spikes downwards, these are all valid Voex spikes. I think we could view it a little bit better if we change the date. Yeah, much better. And Voex spikes typically will resolve in downside within about the next couple of days. So we can see this drastic Voex spike on Netflix here that was, led to a price decrease over the next couple of days from 540 all the way down to 486. That's obviously a huge short. We could see again this huge Voex spike over here where price is at 586 and price dropped, to 500. We could see another huge Voex spike over here. Well, I wouldn't actually consider this such a big Voex spike. This is more of what I'm talking about a Voex spike or something like this, where it's just way out of proportion in terms to everything else, where Voex just shoots up over the course of one day from not such a big price action. And then again, here you can see Voex move from 1020, 2021, all the way down here at minus 34, all the way up here, really quickly, big Voex spike. And what happens after this is just followed by complete and utter destruction of the stock price. So, a lot of times Voex entering the inhibition zone can be a great sign to get long. For example, here when Voex originally entered the inhibition zone, price was at 468, and then Voex stayed in the inhibition zone and price moved all the way to 525. But none of these Voex behaviors were Voex spikes, where Voex moved crazy to the upside like it did here. When we see Voex spikes like this, and Voex spikes like this, and Voex spikes like this, and like this, and like this, that's when alarms should trigger. That's when we know that the market is really not tolerating this move at all, and we have to be alarmed for upcoming downside. We could take another look at some other examples. Let's take a look at SPY really quickly. Now we're going to get into Voex divergence. So we covered Voex in propagation, we covered Voex in stability, we covered Voex in inhibition, we covered Voex spikes, and now finally we're going to cover Voex divergence. All right, so let's zoom in a bit here to make it a little bit more obvious to people. So I want you all to try to see what happened here on wait for it to load. All right, so one more second. Perfect. Now this was actually very helpful to one of our meme stock watch reports, but as you guys can see here, on 6/15, June 15th, we can see price made a move higher from 437 to 439. But look at Voex. Voex moved from 232 to 37. So Voex over here was moving down right here, while price moved higher. That is a classic example of Voex divergence, and that will usually tell us that the end of a rally is coming. Now, can any of you guys see what happened today? Well, actually, that wasn't today because it's on the wrong date. So let's go to, oh, we don't have today's date yet. Something's off a little bit with this Voex. Did not look like that on Friday, but this is the example that we're trying to point out. When price moves higher, but Voex moves lower, that is a bearish indication, and that pretty much tells us that the top should be in, and for at least a couple of days, we can expect downside. We saw it again over here on SPY, where price moved higher this day from 812 to 817. We can see price moving from 419 to 427, while Voex was from 0.5 to 0.49. So Voex was dropping here while price rose, and you could see shortly after there was a large drop in price. So now we've discussed all 5 types of Voexes, which is Voex divergences, Voex spikes, which are typically followed by downside, Voex in the inhibition zone, which is originally bullish, but eventually the gains will be given back when Voex moves back out of the inhibition zone, Voex instability, which shows that the stock is stable, which means we can expect further upside. If that stock's stability represents upside, there are some stocks where Voex will be in stability for a lengthy period of time, and the stock will actually go down. And that tells us that when that stock is in a stable state, its stability shows downside. So it's not super common, but some stocks are so awful that even when Voex is stable, they're just going down. And we also spoke about Voex in propagation zone, which is pretty great precursor for downside. As we can see here, Voex moves into propagation when SPY was at 405, and Voex moves all the way down to 356, while Voex is in the propagation zone. Now that we covered all of those, we're going to go into a couple of more examples just to, make it a little bit more familiar, and then we're going to speak about abnormal Voex. You know what? I'm actually going to stop here for just a couple of minutes, check in on the chat. How's everyone doing? So far, have things make sense? Do you have any specific questions that I could answer? It's 4:19 for about 3 minutes. I'll see if there's any questions that come up. One of them from Nick. So Voex can forecast longer-term moves as well as shorter-term moves, depending on the stock itself. Seems like something it's quicker for price ascend following a move into inhibition than others. So correct, Voex is excellent at predicting day-to-day movement, although it's not its strength. Its strength is more so in understanding the macro factors of the stock. Is this a stable stock? Is Voex an inhibition and we have to be looking over our shoulder for possible downside in the future? Is Voex in propagation and so I wouldn't want to touch it long with a 10-foot pole? Is Voex stable for a long time, showing us that this is a stable stock and this is something I have no problem going long? Where do you view Voex? So Voex is part of Deep Dive Stocks membership. That's where I view Voex, and that gives me a lot of inspiration for trades. So let's look at Clove for a bit, because this is just a nice little example of the propagation zone doing what the propagation zone does. So we can see, relatively stable Voex moving into inhibition, some nice downside, some nice upside that follows, and then right here, Voex moves into the propagation. And you can see that during this entire period that Voex was in the propagation zone, what happened to price? Voex moves into the the propagation zone at about 285, and Clove proceeds to fall all the way to 0.87 cents. So just another example of how Voex in the propagation zone can be a great precursor for following downside to come. Again, throughout this entire time period, Voex was in the propagation zone, and price fell from 260 all the way down to 0.70 cents or so. All right, one more question from Daniel. Followed up on Nick. What would we consider for a time frame, or can we use it to confirm the data of LDPM, velocity, and triggers for an entry, depending if it's a day trade, swing trade, or a scalp? Exactly. So Voex, for example, over here, when Voex moved into the propagation zone, at that point, we could check our triggers, we could check our LDPM, and if price is below a certain key trigger, let's say the hourly trigger crosses below the daily trigger, here, you know what, why don't we do a live example? I think that's a great question. So let's take Clove when Voex moved into the propagation zone, and let's check 8/26/2022. All right. So let's do Clove. We'll take away LDPMs for now. So great question. I'm very happy you brought this up, Daniel, because this is, the point. The point is using Voex to take trades. So again, let's check the date one more time. The date was August, we'll call it August 30th. All right. So August would be right here, August 30th. What happened on August 30th? Is there anything you can pinpoint out, especially that stands out to you about Clove on August 30th? If right now you know the answer, whether you're watching this live or whether you know the answer in your head, kudos to you. You're definitely on the right track. So for anybody else, can you tell me anything that would help us have one short Clove based on Voex moving into the propagation zone on about August 30th? Let's check the exact date again. Right here, we'll call it, it looks like August 30th. Just waiting for any comments to come in. Anybody that knows the answer. All right, if you didn't know the answer, you have some studying to do, but it's okay. Don't beat yourself up about it. Oh, okay, here we go. Bearish cross into bear plane and hourly trigger cross daily trigger. Excellent. Hourly trigger cross below daily trigger. All right, you guys aren't hopeless after all. Good job. So yeah, prices below the monthly trigger, below the weekly trigger, and then the hourly trigger crosses below the daily trigger. So this puts the triggers into the most bearish trigger orientation trend possible, because prices below the hourly, daily, weekly, and monthly triggers at the same time Voex is moving into the propagation zone. So how would this short have worked? What I would have done personally, and you guys could tell me what you would have done in the comments. So we take a look at Clove and we're following along, and all of a sudden we see Voex move into the propagation zone. So when I take a look at this chart, my thought process right now is I want to short. So now that I want to short, let me find a great trigger or a trigger cross to use as my stop loss, as in I would be in the short as long as price is below the trigger, and out of the short if price moves back above the trigger. So without knowing about Voex, if Voex was not in the propagation zone, this trigger cross may have went down, but then, reverse back to the upside, and I may have been stopped out of my short. But knowing that Voex is in the propagation zone at the same time that the triggers get a bearish cross is the perfect confluence for my short. And so I would have went short as soon as the triggers crossed, with a stop loss back above the daily trigger, or if the hourly trigger crosses back above the daily trigger, and I would have profited on this short assuming I went short after the trigger cross, I would have profited 62% on this short. 62% on the downside. Obviously, options could have been a way bigger profit. But this is a great example of how we can use Voex. Moving into the propagation zone, now we go into our charts and we check the setup and we pick a trigger where we want to be short below, flat above, and coincidentally, on the same exact date that Voex moved into the propagation zone, the triggers had the most bearish cross possible, which is the hourly trigger crossing below the daily trigger, while price is below the weekly and the monthly triggers. And sure enough, it was followed by an utter destruction of the stock price. So thank you again, Daniel, for that question, because this demonstrates perfectly how we can use Voex to take trades with the triggers. Now, for those of you who want to get a little bit more in depth, you can start asking yourself, what are the odds and why and how did the triggers get the most bearish cross on the same day that Voex moved into the propagation zone when they're completely opposite and totally unrelated mathematical equations and proprietary information, if you want to call it. But that's not for the bootcamp. Maybe that's for another day. So again, just another great example of using Voex, going onto the chart, figuring out a trigger or a setup where you want to be short below, flat above, and taking the trade. Knowing that you have it on, knowing what you have on your side, which would be Voex telling you that price is going down. Now just figure out a way to short it. And if we were using our LDPM setup, again, fairly simple. This was a bearish LDPM crossover. So when the blue is on top, then this, then this, and this, that's most bearish. And as you can see here, and then when the blue is on bottom, that is most bullish, like you can see here. I should probably make the colors a little bit more distinct. You guys get the point. So even without using the triggers, at the same time that Voex turned bearish, which was August 30th, you had a bearish LDPM crossover, and since then, price went down. Now, let's take a look back at the triggers, because someone just made a really good point about velocity. So if we took this short, we would have gotten in at the trigger cross, and then the most extreme velocity print would have came right here, and then I would have counted 1 new low, 2 new low, 3 new lows without velocity, making a new print to the upside. So like this, and like this, and if you count with me, here's the most extreme print. Here's, pretty much straight downside, followed by a retracement. So sorry, one bearish, we don't count each and every day as a new low. We only count it as a new low if there's a nice retracement, because that actually marks a low. So here, we would have went short on the trigger cross, we would have watched our daily velocity, and we would have had our most extreme print here. Then we would have counted 1 bullish divergence because velocity did not make a new low, 2 bullish divergences because velocity did not make a new low, 3 bullish divergences because velocity did not make a new low, and we would have went short on the trigger cross and closed the short right here at the bottom. Again, a perfect example of how we can use our systems together to create picture-perfect trades with extremely minimal risk while keeping reward very maximum. All right, let's move on from Clove for now. And let me go back to my notebook. All right, let's take a look at ADSK. Okay, so what I wanted to show here was, again, pretty much another picture perfect example of Voex moving back into stability from propagation, moving into stability right here, followed by a really nice move in price. And this move went from 276 to 333. So it may not look like much here, but this is 10.6 all the way to 11. So this is a month, and price went from 276 all the way to 333. So this is kind of called a Voex coiling pattern. So let me actually bring this up. Okay, so we spoke about Voex in the stability zone. That means the stock is moving in a stabilizing manner, usually up. I would recommend anyone screenshot this. We spoke about the inhibition zone. Voex moving into the inhibition zone is initially a bullish finding, but demonstrates that the most recent price action is being worked against, usually resolves on the downside. Propagation zone. Voex falling into the propagation zone is usually indicative of persistent and continued decline in price. We spoke about Voex spikes. A Voex spike is usually provoked by excessive movements. It indicates extreme resistance and usually resolves to the downside, usually short term. We spoke about Voex divergence, when Voex is in the inhibition zone and starts to fall while the price continues to rise. When Voex meets the stable zone, it is indicative that a peak has been reached. And now for the final Voex example, Voex coiling. Voex coiling is a spiky rapid descent and rapid spiky ascent of Voex. When Voex reaches the propagation line, it usually indicates a rally is starting. Let's go back to ADSK right here, and we can see Voex spiking into the propagation zone. So back to the Voex coiling is a spiky rapid descent into the propagation zone. That's what we had right here. Rapid spiky descent in the propagation zone, followed by a rapid spiky ascent back into the stability zone. And once Voex breaches the stability zone, that is indicative of a rally starting. And in this case, this rally would have got you a move from 276 all the way to 333 in the course of 1 month. Obviously, monster gains can be made in that sort of a move. Now, after this, Voex moved back into the propagation zone, which was followed by pretty extreme downside from 278 all the way down to 170. $100 move down when Voex moved into the propagation zone. From there, Voex moves back into stability, price starts to climb a bit, and then, pretty much flat since then. But the point is this Voex coiling pattern. So now let's see how we would have traded this on our charts. So me and you are watching ADSK back in 2021, and we see Voex in the propagation zone starting to coil, and all of a sudden we see Voex starting to spike. And we say to ourselves, hey, this looks like Voex coiling. How can I take advantage of this price action? So let's go to 10/12/2021, and let's go to ADSK. So we're looking for October 12, 2021. October 12. There we go, right here. So now let's see if we could change this to the hourly time frame without losing the place. All right. October 12. Okay, so this is when Voex was still in the propagation zone. And now again, me and you are watching ADSK, and we see all of a sudden on 10/8, 10/9, 10/11, 10/13, we see Voex starting to really move higher. And the day Voex moves into stability, you can see -0.8, -18, 0.61 is the first day that it moves into stability. You can see the sharp rise leading up to that. So if we go to about 10/14 on our charts, which would be right here, we can see, hey, wait a minute, there's potential here because price just broke above the daily trigger. The hourly trigger can cross soon. The hourly trigger can cross the weekly trigger soon. The daily trigger can cross the weekly trigger soon. I can structure a trade here. So a couple of ways we could have done this is once, we get that confirmation, which Voex is still -18, but right here, the very next day, Voex is now positive when price is at 296. So, and this was 10/19, I believe. Yep, 10/19. So we go here. 10/19. Right here is the day that Voex moved into the inhibition zone, into stability, after demonstrating a Voex coiling pattern. So to those of you watching, I would love to hear some of your comments on how you have played this. And this will be sent to the bootcamp right now so that you guys can look at this and study it at a later point. All right, I'm going to wait in the comments how you guys would have played this. I want to see where you would have entered and what your stop loss would have been. for those of you not watching this live, just think in your head what you would have done. Yeah, sorry, I'm gonna go right back to the chart. So here is the date that Voex moved back into stability. Enter after hourly trigger crosses weekly. That would be right here. That would be at 298. Okay, that's one answer. Entering sum after the hourly crosses the weekly and probably trying to add to once getting confirmation with the daily trigger. Okay. Wait for a couple more, and then I'll go into how I would have personally traded this. Remember, there are no wrong answers. Trigger signal is based a lot on personality, so there's no right or wrong way to enter a trade. As long as any trade has a structured trigger as a stop loss, then there's no right or wrong answer. All right, I'm going to jump into the way I would have personally played this. One more from Daniel. It's possible to enter before the gap up. We want confirmation on our data to minimize the downside. Waiting for trigger crosses and entry. Buy in on the hourly trigger crosses daily in a pullback. Another answer from Noah. Wait for the hourly trigger to cross the daily trigger. Enter 50% of calls. Enter the other 50% when hourly trigger crosses weekly trigger. Noah, I like the way you think. Okay, so I'm just going to jump into how I would take this trade. Normally, when I see price breaking above the weekly trigger, I would prefer to wait for the hourly trigger to cross above, unless there's some clues that I don't need to wait for the hourly trigger to cross above because the weekly trigger won't provide resistance. Some of these clues are, for example, we go to weekly velocity. That's the first thing we check. So in this scenario, when you look at this weekly velocity, does this look like weekly velocity that's going to provide resistance, or does this look like weekly velocity that sellers are not strong at the weekly trigger? To me, it looks like weekly velocity where sellers are not strong at the weekly trigger. You know, you want to see strong weekly velocity, you could look at, just take a look at SPY, for example. This is strong weekly velocity. This I would not expect to be broken. This is powerful weekly velocity. But when we go to ADSK, and we go all the way back to October of 2021, we can see that weekly velocity is actually relatively weak. So that's number one. Number two is, normally I would want to wait for the hourly trigger to cross above the weekly trigger because I need confirmation, right, that price is actually broken above the weekly trigger. Because price can move above the weekly trigger and right back below, but if it stays enough for long enough to the hourly trigger to cross above, then it tells you that bulls have now taken control over the weekly trigger. If price breaks above the weekly trigger but breaks below before the hourly trigger could cross above, then it tells you that bears were able to knock it down before bulls took control of the weekly trigger. In this example, I would not have waited for the hourly trigger to cross above the weekly trigger because Voex is already telling us that there was a coiling pattern. Voex was in the propagation zone, coiled, and then right here on 1019, Voex moved back into stability. Once that happens, when I reference the cheat sheet, it usually indicates a rally is starting. Justin is very kind when he writes it usually indicates that a rally is starting, but between me and you, it indicates that a rally is starting. Justin is just a little modest. Now, if I know that a rally is starting, I don't need the hourly trigger to cross above the weekly trigger before entering my position. I will enter my position once Voex shows me the way. And once Voex moves back into stability, that tells me that a rally is about to start. Sure enough, a $40 rally happened over the upcoming month. So, in this scenario, maybe I would have used the hourly trigger as my stop loss. So I would have went long as soon as Voex moved into stability, which was right here on 1019. And then at this point, when I went long, I would have had the hourly trigger as my stop loss. So I probably would have got stopped out here, 209, which is still, a $10 move to the upside within the span of 7 days. 7 days, $10 move to the upside. You guys all know how much options can gain in that time frame. But even if I didn't stop out here, Maybe I told myself, as long as Voex is moving higher, there's no reason to sell because I know that dips will be bought up. So what I could have done was I could have kept the daily trigger as my stop loss, and I would not have had to stop out until much higher levels at 315 instead of 309, not much higher. And if we look at our daily velocity, so if we're just tracking daily velocity, we could have went long here. Again, everything looks healthy here with price making new highs and daily velocity making new highs. And then over here, we can see our first bearish daily divergence. And once we have one bearish daily divergence, if price sells below the hourly trigger, then it's a lot more likely the price will go back to the daily trigger. But here, where there's, looks like here again, there's one bearish divergence. So when price broke below the hourly trigger, it came back down to the daily trigger, caught a nice bounce. The point is, even if I would have traded this in and out, meaning long every time price breaks above the hourly trigger, flat when price is below the hourly trigger, so I could have went long again here, 311, traded up to 333, again in the span of a very short period of time, only 6 days, $20 move to the upside. The point is that when Voex moves back into stability, it overrides some of our rules that we use because Voex is already telling you what's going to happen before it happens. And so we don't have to be so strict with waiting for confirmation when Voex already gave us the confirmation. So that is the Voex lesson. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them now. Again, we went over, Daniel says, knowing the triggers, could have gone in early, sold out on the first run up, bought the support at the weekly. Exactly. Yeah. So again, we went over stability. Voex in the stable zone means Voex is between the two horizontal lines. This means the stock is moving in a stabilizing manner, and stable stocks usually move to the upside. Voex moving into the inhibition zone is initially a bullish finding, but demonstrates that the most recent price action is being worked against, usually resolves on the downside. That's the inhibition zone. Voex falling into the propagation zone is usually indicative of a persistent and continued decline in price. That's the propagation zone. Voex spikes are usually followed by, is usually provoked by excessive movements. It indicates extreme resistance. This move is really being worked against and fought against, and usually resolves in the downside, usually short term. So we're not expecting extreme downside, but at least some short-term downside. Usually within 5 days after a Voex spike, we'll see some downside. Then we went over divergence. When Voex is in the inhibition zone and starts to fall while the price continues to rise. When Voex meets the stable zone, it is indicative that a peak has been reached. And finally, Voex coiling. Voex coiling is a spiky rapid descent and rapid spiky ascent of Voex. So first the descent down here, and then spiky ascent. When Voex reaches the propagation line, it usually indicates that a rally is starting. These are the 6 types of Voex. These are the most important, and these should help you greatly to understand direction of a stock. Now, Christopher was asking, what day did the Voex dip on ATSD? So Voex moved into the propagation zone. We could see it was positive 2.3 on 8.19, and then the next day it was negative 0.27 on 8.23. So we go to 8.19, which is August 19th. So that was right here. And then the next day, the 23rd, is when it dipped into propagation. So that's actually really cool because, already on 8.18. Okay, so, wait. Am I doing this right? Oh, when did it dip after Voex coiling? So over here, when Voex moved back into stability on 11/24, that told you that the rally was over. Now, I bet if we really zoom in, maybe we could have seen some kind of Voex divergence. But either way, that's all for today's class. Yeah, so you guys could easily see this Voex divergence that happened on the last day of the ADSK rally. You can see that price continued to move higher. Just wait for it to get clear again. We can see price continues to move higher here, but look at Voex. Voex is going straight down. So that is Voex divergence. So again, this will be Voex coiling, and this would be Voex divergence, where price is still moving higher in ADSK, but Voex is definitely moving lower, showing Voex divergence. And as you can see, just like in the cheat sheet, once Voex meets the stable zone, it is indicative that a peak has been reached. So too, over here, once Voex met the stability zone, it is indicative that a peak has been reached. And this happened on the exact same day. So perfect example, Christopher. Thank you for asking me to check it out. Okay. Voex coiling is not super often, but if you guys have been following the meme stock watch updates, you'll notice that AMC is actually having a Voex coiling pattern of its own right now. That's not right. Yeah, so this is the AMC coiling, but however, for AMC, Voex was not able to get back into the stability zone. So if it does get back into the stability zone, then that will complete the Voex coiling pattern. But for not, it's almost there. For now, it's almost there, but not quite yet. All right, everybody. I hope this was helpful, and looking forward to tomorrow's session where we'll go over snap graphs.